Okay, I think we are ready to start our next session, which is an ECFR Insight by ECFR's European Power Program Director, Susi Dennison. And she is going to present what we call the European Sovereignty Index, which was launched last week. And the index scores the EU and its member states on their contribution to European sovereignty in 6 crucial areas. And this is part of our big research project called Reshape, which analyzes Europe's role in the world and which we are conducting thanks to the support of the Mercator Foundation. And this project also includes the European Power Atlas that we launched last December during our ACM. So please welcome Susi Dennison, who's going to give the presentation.
Thank you very much, Anna, and hello there to everybody that I haven't managed to speak to yet at the ACM. So, the discussion on European sovereignty is obviously not a new one. As we learned in the quiz last night, it's already one where, as ECFR, we can claim to have had some impact with discussions around what we would like sovereignty to look like in different areas. But what is new is the ability to measure sovereignty. And what we've been working on, as Anna mentioned, over the last 6 months, is a tool that allows us to engage in an evidence-based debate with member states about where we need to develop and where we need to do more. So this is obviously the first step to understanding how to manage the complex interdependencies that characterise today's world, and how to have the freedom of manoeuvre to act in a way that is according to our principles and values in a competitive environment. In a few slides, I'm going to present this index, and this has really been a collaborative effort across not only the European Power Programme of ECFR, but also the broader team. So, yeah, you just get me today, but there's a big team behind me. So, how sovereign is Europe? What's our headline finding? It is that European sovereignty is good on health and the economy, but only satisfactory on defence, climate and migration, and poor on technology. And member states are making very varied contributions to this picture. How did we come to this conclusion? Well, we used open source data and the results of our survey of our 27 associate researchers in all of the different member states to score EU member states on their contribution on 6 terrains according to their potential. In each area, we conduct the scoring by focusing on 2 specific case studies. For example, on economy, the focus is on trade and investment. On migration, the focus is on management of common borders and resilience to manipulated surges of migration. And we get to an EU-level result by taking an average of the 27 member state results. But this isn't a simple average, because we take the view that the larger the country, the bigger the impact on European sovereignty. And therefore, we've opted for the same system which is used in the QMV methodology in the Council, weighted average based on population. And finally, it's important to note that we've tried to look at member states' capabilities as well as their commitments separately in each terrain, which allows us to better understand whether there's any disconnect between the two. So, staying on that point, let's start off with some of the areas in which we've performed strongly. Health sovereignty is one of the areas where the performance is good, thanks to a strong performance on both commitments and capability. And the same goes for the economy. These are the 2 areas where we can see that the impact of having both capability and commitment works out for an overall strong score. Defence sovereignty is one of the most interesting areas. Here we can see that capabilities are actually lagging behind commitments, translating only into an overall satisfactory result, which is why you get the yellow picture. But even that result is actually somehow inflated by strong performances of the 3 largest countries, Germany, France and Italy. And meanwhile, there are 11 member states that are actually failing in this area. So this is the field actually in which the range of scores between member states is highest. Climate is a story where actually commitments are much better than capabilities at the moment. Some countries, especially in Scandinavia, have really strong scores, really good scores, but they're too small to pull up the EU's results overall. Migration story, the one that I worked on, is an exception to this rule on commitment and capability. Here, they're similar levels and they're only satisfactory. What's more, migration is the field in which the spread of individual member states' results is the smallest. So what you get here is that you've got collective responsibility between the member states for a mediocre result. It's not so much that any state is dragging the score up or down, but that the case for a collective European approach hasn't really been digested by the Union as a whole, despite efforts centrally from the EU institutions to push this. And then finally, technology. This is the lowest performing area. Interestingly, you'll see that the commitment in this field is really good, but capabilities are missing, which is why it translates into an overall poor score and the only one of the 6 terrains where this is the case. This really, I think, reflects the reality of where we are at the moment in thinking about tech, which is that we know we need to do better, but we're not quite there yet. So much for the pan-European story, but there are 2 other ways that you can read the Sovereignty Index, and I do encourage you after this quick presentation to go away and play with it, including on the big screen in the coffee break area. So one way you can look at it is each of these terrains separately, looking at the best and worst performing countries in each area. But you can also look at the country profiles to get to see the broader role of each member state on European sovereignty. And as we like rankings and groups at ECFR, we've grouped them into 4 different camps: leaders, drivers, one-hit wonders, and underperformers. At one level, the Sovereignty Index does confirm a certain east-west divide and also some north-south divide, as you can see on this slide here. And so within this picture, some of the eastern or southern member states are strongly committed to the idea of European sovereignty, but perhaps lacking sufficient capabilities. So overall, this translates into poorer results. But it's also worth looking at the complexities within this picture, because there are some. For example, Slovenia and Estonia, 2 of the newer member states, are not underperforming. Austria is a wealthy EU member state that's not a leader or a striver. And Spain and Italy, southern states, who put in a strong performance on a few key areas and then therefore count as a one-hit wonder. So very briefly, let's look at a few of the examples. France, current presidency. One of the 5 leaders, which I guess is no surprise, of European sovereignty, being the home of the idea, although we would dispute that at ECFR. So the leaders of the countries that currently champion European sovereignty through their excellent contribution in specific areas, or a very strong performance overall. So France is a leader thanks to its excellent performance on defence, although disappointing in some other fields, such as migration. Germany, another leader, again no surprise, hosting us today, so we weren't going to say anything different, with excellent performance on health. But interestingly, it's only number 5 on economy because its commitments aren't matching with the capabilities, as we found. Just for an example of a striver, I'm going to show you Finland, one of the countries that received relatively high scores overall and make an important contribution to European sovereignty in at least 3 areas. And it's also number 1 on technology and number 3 on climate, also good on health. Spain is part of the 3rd group of one-hit wonders. So this includes 7 countries that are doing neither particularly well or particularly poorly overall, but they're helpful in 1 or 2 areas on European sovereignty. So for Spain, it's got good scores on health and the economy, but as in France's case, its results on migration pulls it down, and capabilities don't match commitments on technology or climate. But there are also 11 underperformers. In the EU. One example here, Poland. So this group includes countries with low or very low scores who aren't pulling their weight in strengthening European sovereignty overall. Obviously, we hope that this index is going to be a useful tool for you, for decision makers and analysts across the EU. It's clear that this is intended to stimulate national discussions when it's so clear that the fierce geopolitical environment is highlighting the need for European sovereignty in these areas. We do obviously expect it to provoke some resistance and lively debate. That's what we like. But this is only a good sign for us, because after all, what we want is for the index to be a conversation starter, not the last word. So with that said, let the conversation begin. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Susi, and I'm sure the conversation will begin looking at the assessments of strengths and weaknesses. I think this also perfectly sets us up for the next panel, which will tackle the question, Europe fit for purpose. But I also want to point out, I think what is really great about the Sovereignty Index are the great visuals. I think this really helps to understand this very comprehensive set of facts. Now I would like to turn to our next and final panel, which will be moderated by Jana Puglerin, who heads our Berlin office. And I would like to ask Jana to come to the stage. And also our panelists, we have Franziska Brantner, Arancha González, Manuel Lafont Rapnouil, and Alexander Stubb. So please proceed to the stage.
Es que quiero hacerte una propuesta decente. Okay. So we are approaching the finishing line of our ACM, and we have kept a special treat for the very end. We'll discuss European sovereignty, a concept which is very close to ECFR's heart. We love to talk about European sovereignty. We've shaped the debate, and there could be no better last panel than one on this very topic. And I'm grateful to have an all-star cast to discuss this with me. Friends of ECFR for a very long time. Everybody here was very engaged in the past to help us strive. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for agreeing to discuss this with us. I encourage all of you to please have a look at the index. A huge amount of work went into it, of passion, of dedication. I think the graphics are outstanding. So it really tells you something about European sovereignty. It's fun to navigate through the website. So please, if you have a moment and don't have anything else to do during, I don't know, a busy office day, just have a look. So I want to discuss some of the findings of the index with you, but before I do that, I want to measure the overall temperature when it comes to the concept of European sovereignty, because much to the satisfaction of us at ECFR, we have seen growing awareness in member states. We have seen a growing realization that Europe needs to be more capable to act globally, to not be a plaything, but a player, and not to be shaped by others. We see this in Brussels, we see this in the German coalition agreement, we see this, of course, in France. So overall, we've seen great progress in recent years, as I think the index also shows. But now the war happened. So before the war started, there were negotiations between Russia and the United States over the heads of the Europeans. Now the US provides more military aid than all European countries combined. Humanitarian aid, the US is leading by far. And one could argue, I think, or I put that to the test here, that the US was instrumental to keep the West together, or to bring the West together and to bring the Europeans on board. So what we see is strong US leadership, a very committed Biden administration, and some people might think that without the US, we are just helpless bystanders, so let's forget about this whole idea of European sovereignty and let's just invest in a better transatlantic alliance, although both concepts might not be a contradiction. But my colleagues, and I end with that, my colleagues Jeremy Shapiro and Maida Ruge have just written a piece where they basically say, one of the most paradoxical casualties of war has been the concept of European sovereignty. So would you agree with this? Is the concept obsolete, as other observers have said about other international institutions? So European sovereignty, is it still a thing? And I start with you, Manuel, because you're from France and you have, I think, a natural right to talk about this.
You're all very worried about my answer. I always surprised when I see this idea of European sovereignty being the first casualty of war, because if you look at what we've managed in spite of the war during the last 6 months in terms of legislative agenda, and I don't know about the European sovereignty concept, but I know about the European sovereignty agenda, and that has moved forward so incredibly for these last 6 months. We've moved ahead on the economy, on trade defense. We're moving on energy now. We've moved ahead on the digital with DSA and DMA. We've moved ahead on climate, that was mentioned. We've moved ahead on security and defense with the strategic compass. But the real reason why I'm not worried is because of China and Russia, which basically are making the best case that we can think of why we need to organize to be able to keep some kind of interdependence without suffering from the vulnerabilities that come with it, from the risk of these interdependencies to be weaponized. And I'm also not so worried because I understand that there is still some doubts and questions about the terminology and the concept, but I see a lot of agreement and substance, and sometimes I feel that the French messengers kills the sovereignty message, so I'll stop here and let my colleague do the argument.
Thank you very much. So let's not kill the message through the messenger. And I want to have a first quick round and hear from all of you about your overall assessment, temperature, European sovereignty. How well are we doing as Europeans? Arancha.
Well, let me park the discussion about what word we use. I personally prefer to use the word autonomy to sovereignty, but because maybe I've read a little bit about the history, and sovereignty is a concept that makes me gets me a bit uncomfortable. But let me answer your question with 3 additional questions. Because I think what we are faced with is, as Europeans, this concept of sovereignty, autonomy, or whichever way we want to call it, asks for 3 answers to 3 questions from us. First question, does Europe really want to be the builder of a new international order? Does it want to be a shaper? Or does it just want to be someone that follows the order, voluntarily or inadvertently, the order that someone else is shaping? And that someone else for now is China on the one side and the US on the other side. So the first question we have to ask when we ask sovereignty is, do we want to be a builder? And do we want to build with our own sense of interests and values? Or do we just want to be the appendix of somebody else? Second question we have to answer is, what kind of order do we want to build? So sovereignty for what? Now, I was a bit nervous when I read, maybe it was done on purpose, when I read the paper, the invitation you sent around to all of us, saying that should we go for power instead of laws and institutions? And it got me a little bit nervous, because I thought that we wanted to build an order based on laws and institutions, which is also a way of expressing power. And the third question we have to ask is, do we have the ability to do that? And I want to put the confidence word in answering this question. Do we have enough confidence? Because I think what I see at the moment is a bit of a lack of confidence on the European side to really be the builder of this future system with determination, with passion, with all the flaws that we have to face, and frankly, there are many flaws all along the way, with all the difficulties and the challenges, but also with the confidence that we can build. So that's my 3 questions to your question, if I'm...
Thank you. Although it's, I think it's tactics to answer a question with a question or with 3 questions.
This is the privilege of foreign ministers, you know.
But I think I just come back to you with your questions again, and then we'll see where we land. But first, Franziska, you have been amongst the builders of the coalition treaty, and you have been an advocate for this concept in Germany for a long time. So, so what is your take, looking at, what did the war do to the concept, and what is still necessary? Where are we?
Yeah, as you know, we have the goal of strategic sovereignty of Europe in our coalition treaty, and I see members of our coalition majority here, and I think that this was important for Germany to say this is actually our goal. And then we define it as the capacity to act according to our values and to reduce our vulnerabilities. And I think it was good that we really worked on saying, what does it mean to us, and didn't just write the name in it. And of course, you know, there it says the capacity to act to defend your values. There is a purpose in it, and to reduce vulnerabilities in terms of staying interconnected, interdependencies, but as you said, Manuel, be less vulnerable when they're weaponized. And when you understand it in this way, I think we have progressed. As Manuela said, you know, we have now a foreign subsidies instrument, or almost, you know, we are really advancing on some of the key instruments that we need in this regard. But I also think that I do not want to imagine the last couple of months with Trump in the US driver's seat. This would have been terrible. So, you know, to be honest, I think we have been quite reliant on the Trump administration in terms of information, convening power, etc. And we should not minimize it. But at the same time, it shows us how much we still have to do, because who knows who will be the next president in the US. And I think that sort of, you know, in between we have progress, which I really believe in, but there's still a long way to do. And I think that what I've learned the last couple of months is that we have really, you know, we have a sustainability track, and then we have a resilience track, and the challenge is still to merge them, to make it a sustainable prosperity and resilience track, and bring them together. And the second one, and I think that's the even more difficult one, is that we see that the question of resilience and sustainability has deep distributional implications, internally and within the EU. And that if we do not address those wealth distribution questions, we probably will not get very far. And I think that this is, you know, one of the very difficult ones. We see it now with the energy prices, but we see it on many fronts. And we see it within the member states, who gets gas, who doesn't, to what price, the oil prices. So it's a lot about distribution of wealth, which the EU didn't have to debate for a couple of years, and I think which are on the forefront. And last point, I think we have to, you know, re-establish partnerships with the world, but many would like to go back to a status quo ante before we withdrew and left it all to China and others. And I think that is a really wrong picture, that if you go to Latin America and want to go back to the old relationship, they just tell you, then we can stay with the Chinese. No, thank you. And they have a good, I think they're right, you know, but this requires a lot of rethink of our trade policy, of our digital policy, and I don't see that we're there yet at all, by far, but I can go into detail afterwards.
Thank you very much. Alex, I hope you don't come up with 3 additional questions, but even though being a government official in the past, so what is the Finnish perspective on the temperature when it comes to European sovereignty?
I have no clue, but I can give you the Italian perspective. Oh, but I mean, let me try to give you 3 points. I mean, the first one is on the concept itself, sovereignty. I'm very much with Ivan Krastev on this. I think it's counterintuitive, and to a certain extent, for us as Europeans, it's sort of the end of history turning into the beginning of history, because we've actually been against the whole idea of sovereignty. I mean, the whole idea of European integration is to pool sovereignty, to share sovereignty, and now we're talking about strategic sovereignty, basically closing shop, and it falls very much into the category of argumentation that we believed in a world where economic interdependence would lead to security. And now for us to talk about sovereignty as opposed to interdependence, if that is the juxtaposition, then I think we're entering a new world. But that leads me to the two additional points. One is about sovereignty and security, and the other one is about sovereignty in economy. I think what the war has done is perhaps put the whole idea of strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty in the security field a little bit on the back burner. You know, we felt, and I belong to that category as well, that Arancha was pointing out, that we were perhaps moving towards some kind of a tripolar world with China, the United States, and Europe. And therefore, strategic sovereignty for us meant that we would start taking care of our own security a little bit more. I think that idea has now been suspended, at least for a while to come. I don't know for how long, and this is, you know, coming back to your point, we don't know whether Trump or Biden is a footnote of history. You know, if Trump is, then the security agenda will continue, but if Biden is, then, you know, it'll be the other way around. Then my third point is on the economy, and here is where I call for caution. And because I think the idea of economic sovereignty can be used as a tool of protectionism. And I mean, I joked around with Manuel, and we were there as well in Berlin, that, you know, I'm okay with the concept of strategic autonomy as long as it doesn't, you know, involve Danone yogurt, if you know what I mean. So the bottom line is that we shouldn't be going to a world where sovereignty means stopping, economic flows and the four freedoms that we've been talking about so much. And this is probably the aspect of it that I'm most afraid of. Having said that, I think there's a sentiment in the world right now that we're not moving towards globalization, but probably a regionalization of globalization, where crucial value chains will be brought back home, whether they're about vaccines or masks or what it might be. And there's been sort of three things that have forced us to think about this anew. One was Donald Trump and his America First thinking also on value chains. Second one was COVID, and the third one is now this war. So, it's a concept that's going to be in a flux, but I'm not, too excited about it, even though it's an ECFR concept, because sovereignty to me is can be about closing shop, I think, globally in security and in economy.
So let's dive a little deeper into the issues that the index also addresses. And Alex, you already mentioned security and defense. The index shows that there is a big weakness still in Europe. And the index also shows that there is a clear divide between those countries that still see the US security guarantee basically as their lifeline, as existential, and those that also consider the EU as an important player in security and defense, and that want to see a stronger EU role on security and defense in the future. So some countries are rather in favor, others aren't. And coming back to Arancha and this idea, if you really want to be a builder, there seems to be not kind of one clear-cut message coming from our index. Some want to be builders, others don't. And maybe, Alex, I start with you, and we do it the other way around. How do we deal with a looming Trump 2 administration and a Biden administration that also says, well, in the long run, the major challenge comes from China. You Europeans need to do more. If we have these camps in Europe, is there any way how to reconcile them? How can we build better European security and defense with the Europeans being more of an actor Is that the EU framework? Is that NATO framework? Is it both? Does the framework not matter? So what would be your policy recommendation?
Apart from Finland and Sweden joining NATO. No, tongue-in-cheek, jokes aside, I mean, I guess my general observation is to say that we probably made two historic mistakes in Europe, which have been brought to the fore in this war in Ukraine. The first one was to rely on Russian energy. Again, it was our idea of interdependence as opposed to sovereignty, but with Russia it didn't work. And the second one was to rely on American security. And what I think this war will probably lead to is that we will wean ourselves off of Russian energy, which is a good thing. But I think on American security, we're not there yet. What do I want to see? I want to see Europe take more responsibility, but I don't want to see, and this is a classic view from a country living right next to Russia, I don't want to see duplication. I would probably want to see a more European NATO rather than a more NATO Europe. If you see what I'm saying, it's not an easy one to deal with, but because security in our mind is so collective, we can't separate it into EU defense and security apart from NATO defense and security. I think they have to go hand in hand. So I would probably, may I just, this is a bit of a crazy idea, but why not, have full EU membership in NATO to a certain extent, take more of a leading role in NATO? Because now we're going to be in a situation where there are only 4 EU countries that are not in NATO. So sort of a step-by-step Europeanization of NATO is probably what I would call for.
Thank you very much. Franziska, us in Germany, we have been champions of, we want to eat the cake and have it. Like we always said, yes, more European sovereignty, but in order to have a better transatlantic relationship. We want to be good partners of the United States, but if there is a crisis, if the US is not able or willing to act, we want to do it on our own. So the idea was always that this is possible. And my question to you is now the government puts a lot of money to the table. And the money, as far as I understand, goes mostly to F-35 or heavy transport helicopters, all produced in the United States. So how do you think Germany could better or best balance European efforts kind of in the transatlantic realm and kind of European EU efforts? Is there a contradiction? Do you think we can stick to that? It's not a contradiction. We can basically have it both ways and we strengthen everything at the same time? Or do we need to prioritize? So what is the German take?
As you said, 100 billion on top, not in 1 year, but the next couple of years. And yes, we will buy American, also because of speed. And at the same time, and I was just working on this again this morning, we have this week, first reading in Parliament, a law on procurement, defense procurement, where we make quite substantive changes to facilitate European projects. Because we see the obstacles in our procurement laws to pan-European projects that make them much more complicated than buying American. So at the same time as we are buying American, because we need something now, to be frank, we set the groundwork for facilitating European cooperation and European projects. And I think that is sort of, we're not doing all at the same time, but it is laying the groundwork, at least for the more midterm to long-term projects, to be in a European way. And that was also important for me to have, in this reform, to have that European dimension in there. And I think it will help quite a bit when it comes to European consortia to construct on sort of German money or co-financed by Germany. And I think, the big projects are still in the pipeline. They're still work done. I don't have to say that they're easy, but they're not given up. So I think, we're trying to see that so far really, and I said this really, really without the Biden administration, we would be much worse off these days. But at the same time, I think it would be ignorant and dangerous not to see the risks of having another Trump or somebody even worse in the US. Like if you travel to the US, I have rarely been in such a polarized country. It's scary to see. I hope it will heal and become better. And then you kind of say, look at France, it's also not, but still I think we have as Europeans the duty to prepare the groundwork for more European action as well. And if that in the end, I think sometimes let's just do it and stop discussing if we do it this way or the other way. I think in the end, what we need is the capabilities. And as long as we in the EU have this unanimity rule with Orban, seriously, we will have to reform anyhow, quite substantially, I think. Because that has been the painful moment in the last couple of months within the EU, to see power limited of the EU by somebody like Orban one day after he got elected. That was really such, for me, everybody knew the day he will be elected, it will become difficult in council, and it was exactly like this. So I think that's the European problem we have to address. If we want the EU to be a more powerful actor, we have to change our rules. Otherwise, it won't work.
Thank you. Arancha, Franziska just said it's all about capabilities in the end, and just let's do it in whatever framework. Let's encourage the Europeans to do more together as Europeans, but there is also urgency. So how is that seen in Spain? You asked us, do the Europeans want to be builders? So do you think we want to be a builder in defense? And if so, how can we get there to really make a difference? I mean.
No, we are used to walking with or basically focusing on two ingredients: the economy and the social. Let's not forget that this is a distinct feature also of the EU, that it cares about how wealth is not just generated but how it's distributed. And now we have to invest more on security because we have realized that we have a weakness there. And let me tell you that on this, I am exactly on the same line as Alex. We don't have to choose. What we have to do is to build our security resilience. Now, how do we do that? At the moment, we are doing this in a very disjointed manner. It's EU member states doing it, partly as part of the EU. Let's not forget that we now have Denmark that also wants to build more EU security and defense. To a large extent outside in NATO, but as EU member states. So what if we were the EU in NATO? It would make a difference. And at the end of the day, it would build our resilience. So seen from Spain, and I guess this is part of the conversation that we will have in the upcoming NATO summit. At least this is one of the reasons why my compatriot Christina and I fought very hard when we were in government to have NATO summits happen in Spain. Well, we were not maybe anticipating that it would be such a moment, but it was with this idea that Europe has to build more resilience also in security and defense. For sure, we have to do this also on the economy, and here I think the challenge we have is building this resilience, avoiding a fragmentation of the world, avoiding the friendshoring or nearshoring or decoupling, which are all these fancy words that speak of fragmenting the level playing field. It's not going to be good for Europeans, but I worry even more about what this will mean for many developing countries out there. And I'm looking at George because there is one thing that I've learned from George, is that we have to care not just about ourselves, we have to care about many of our neighbors who depend also on being capable of trading, of connecting, on getting the investment that they need to improve their economies. So resilience is the name of the game, and we have to do this, in my view, in an open manner, not in a closed door manner.
So last question on security and defense to you, Manuel. I know it's a topic dear to your heart. When you hear two people arguing for a stronger EU in NATO, how does the French in you react to this? As far as I understood, the French philosophy was not to make NATO basically the main organization for to organize European sovereignty in security and defense. I always thought that the idea was different. So,
so yes, I think my sense is that what we want is both a more active and up-to-task NATO, and this is what should happen in Madrid. And that's why, for instance, France has added contribution to the Eastern Forward Presence and has created this idea of of having a similar kind of deployment on the southern side of the eastern flank in Romania. This is why France is supporting Finland and Sweden, but there are also all these things happening on the EU side. We've mentioned Denmark, obviously, which is quite significant to show that precisely, even if you're in NATO, you may think that there is added value to be in the EU. But also we've seen what the EU has done at the beginning of the conflict. And it doesn't mean that we are there yet. I said the agenda has moved forward. There's a new agenda to set up. And on defense, clearly, there's quite a lot of stuff. What do we do in terms of spending, of investment, including in research and development? What do we do in terms of output? Because it's not just an input issue. What do we do in terms of innovation? I've mentioned it. What do we do in terms of the defense industry? And that's the biggest stake behind the projects that Franziska mentioned. What do we do in terms of strategic culture? These are all things where the EU has added value and can really bring something and bring it to the EU as such and to NATO also. So I don't really think that there is a risk. And on the contrary, I hear more and more, again, it's a shame that you have a French diplomat on the stage, but for instance, the Estonian Prime Minister keeps saying now that she believes that a stronger European defense is very important for stronger transatlantic ties.
Sounds very German.
Totally support that. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Another area where I want to dive deeper into is climate, and then I open it up to the broader panel. Franziska, do you want to add something, a footnote?
No,
of course.
If I may, because Alex and you also mentioned this idea of the sovereignty, autonomy not being inward-looking. De facto, it is forcing us to be engaging with the rest of the world. For me, the European strategic sovereignty agenda is the most ambitious agenda in terms of engaging with the rest of the world. So far, we have not. We have been relying for energy on Russia and exports on China. And now we are forced to go back to Africa, to Latin America, to the rest of Asia, and it forces us and our companies to engage with more difficult countries.
Yeah.
And I think it has been so easy to interact with autocratic capitalist countries that many are saying, but anything else but China is much more complicated. And probably it is. Dealing with NGOs, indigenous people in Chile, is a bit more complicated than having lithium in China, where you don't have to worry about any kind of environmental standards, human rights standards whatsoever. So for us to go back and say we do this more difficult, more strenuous step in re-engaging with the rest of the world is de facto the duty and the difficulty as well, because it really is not so easy. And if in our trade policies, I give you one concrete example, because I just was in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay for 1 week. I just got back this weekend. And when you speak to Chile and the EU-Chile agreement on trade, they say, look, we're ready and we would be very happy to engage with you as Europeans on lithium. Very happy. They really want it. But they say, if you want us to prefer you over the Chinese, help us on the indigenous people, get companies that do involvement of local people, do it so that you use less water, do it in a green energy way, and help us to make local production. If you come and do it the Chinese way, we're not interested. And I think that's for us to challenge, to show that we're able of doing this, that our companies, that our investments are ready to do that next step. And our EU-Chile trade agreement doesn't foresee any kind of local, provisions for lithium, for example. And I think that's the difficulty. Are we ready to make that step and redefine our trade agenda to a really fair one that involves their interests and needs, that is a better deal for them than China? Are we ready to do this? It will be more expensive, I can tell you. And are we ready to pay that price? And I think that's the real question we have to ask ourselves, if we are ready to engage with the world.
So Alex, I'll give you the floor in a second, but just I want to mention that at ECFR with the index, we have defined European sovereignty as the ability of Europeans also to manage complex interdependence. So that matches perfectly with your kind of idea. So Alex, before you comment on what Franziska has said, I want to give you two tasks. You can comment on this, but then I also want to move to climate. So, and actually this is a good opportunity for your Nordic identity still, leaving the Italian part aside, because the Nordics, when it comes to climate in our index, are spearheading the European member states, especially Sweden and Denmark, but also Finland. And maybe I wanted to ask you, maybe you can tell us something, what the Nordics do better, and give us advice how we could become more Nordic in the rest of Europe. So two tasks, not really maybe interlinked, but I'm sure you can make that.
Given that I'm in Germany, I'd feel really tempted to go on a rant about the virtues of nuclear power, but I'll hold back. But I'll try to link actually two things from what the ECFR does. One is the sovereignty report that we just heard, but I think we should actually link it with the power atlas, because what we're doing right now is probably talking about sovereignty in a way which is a little bit, if I may again use the term old school or old fashioned, and a little bit too militant. So we look at geopolitics very much in terms of the sovereignty of military, of weapons, of soldiers, etc. Whereas actually, if we live in this sort of Marx world of age of unpeace, where everything can be weaponized, I actually think that the European Union has the whole instruments of weapons at its disposal, including trade and sanctions, including technology, information. It can use a lot of these modern instruments, and that's we need to sort of break out of that box of, sovereignty is only about military. But here's where we come to my second point, which is going to be more complicated, probably for, how would I say, former empires or big powers in the European Union. And that is the way in which we behave with the third world. And I think the war in Ukraine is just a symptom of it. People are celebrating the fact that in the UN there was 141 votes against Russia, 35 abstained and 4 in favor. But if you scrape the surface, you very quickly realize that the 141 votes were actually very soft and scrambled together last minute. The 35 that abstain are over half of the world's population, and then forget the 4 rogue states. So for me, this conflict is not only about Russia and the West, but also about the West and the rest. And here is where we come into the fact, how are we, in a dignified way, going to be able to push what I would call the European agenda? And it is going to be extremely difficult, because we can't go with the typical, if I may, sorry to say this, but slightly colonial, high moral ground that we've been doing for the past decades and centuries. We're going to have to go into those countries with a little bit of humility and saying, yeah, the world order has changed. This is very complicated. And how are we going to do this? And am I saying here that we should give up our sort of value-based foreign policy? No, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that we're going to have to make some very difficult compromises. as we move into the future, because the world order is not anymore about a European or Western world order. And then the question becomes, do we want to save the rules-based world order, which is based on our values, or do we try to take the moral high ground and push for the value base that we have? I think it's a really tough question. I don't have the answer.
Okay, and on climate, I need to ask Lücke in the coffee break what the Danes just do better. But maybe sticking to the climate question, and actually going back to you, Franziska, because you said it's about also managing interdependence and realizing how dependent we've become on certain actors which see the EU as an opponent or an adversary. When it comes to energy and all the measures that are taken now to invest in renewable energy, isn't there a danger, and I've heard this now from several people, that the EU becomes too much reliant on China for solar panels, for example, that kind of we go from one dependency into the other, and that there is not enough awareness. And people are asking, how can it be that China is now basically, that we need to import a technology that we have basically invented in the first place? So comment on that.
I don't want to go into the mistakes of the past, why we lost that industry. It's a closed chapter. And I think there's a difference in terms of the dependency structure, because you are dependent on the establishment of it, but once you have it here and it's constructed, you are no longer dependent. And I think that's still a big difference in terms of how long does the dependency go. You're not once you have your solar panel, you don't need China for the sun to turn it into electricity. But it still doesn't relieve us from the difficulty that for the production of wind and solar, we are quite heavily dependent on Chinese rare earth. And it's not necessarily that they're Chinese, but it's the first and second step of processing, which is almost 100% in Chinese hands. And the question is, how do we get a diversification in that? That's why I was in Latin America, because they have copper, they have lithium, they have everything. And we're not there. And it's very sad or frustrating to see that all of these licenses a couple of years ago were first offered to German companies that graciously declined. You're there, you're like, how can I have been that stupid? But it's not as if we hadn't been in that new area already, but it's, that's unfortunately reality. And I think that if we do it and want to diversify, it will not be from one day to the next, but a slow diversification process. We just have to make sure that we do it in a sustainable way. And I really think that this can be on an equal footing an agreement. And we have to realize that on these climate protection issues, for example, when I go as a German to Uruguay, they have 97% renewable energy. Who am I to lecture them anything? They're the ones who are much further ahead. They have their public buses, electricity. How many electricity buses do we have in Berlin, in Germany, in France? There's so many points that I just am like, I would be happy to learn from you. How do you speed up your processes? Maybe we can do something similar in Germany. So I think really, as you said, it's a different way of talking that we have to start. Otherwise, we will not find partners. And I think it's urgent to get away from the dependency on China, but it will take time. It's much more difficult and much more strong than on Russia. We have no 100% dependency on Russia.
Thank you very much. I ask Arancha and Manuel, I ask you the question on climate too, but with a different angle, because one of the problems that we identified with the index is that European member states don't invest enough in innovative technologies and are not really at the forefront of developing those technologies. And I think this is a broader problem. We see that also when we look at actually technology and the index. So what would be we were asked to come up with changeable policy advice. So what should Europe focus on now in the next years to get better on kind of, more innovative, better at the kind of high-end technologies? What should we do differently?
So this is a very well-known European problem, which has been explored, which has been dissected, and for which there is a plan of action. The problem in Europe is not coming up with new technologies, it's not the innovation capacity. Europe has leading innovation capacity in the world. The problem is marketing the innovation, bringing this innovation to the market, especially when the innovation comes from a smaller let's say startups, from smaller companies where access to finance is a key ingredient, and we know, and a number of people, including in this panel, have been working on that to make sure that innovation can be brought to the market and accelerated. This is where the problem lies, and it's as much for climate change as it is for the digital economy, which is another one of the areas where the index showed some limitations in Europe.
Manuel, quick comment, or should I open and you take the first question from the audience?
Well, if the question is for me, yes, I think questions are always interesting.
Okay, so Manuel volunteers to take the first question. So you can ask a French official whatever you want to, and he is forced to answer. So I have Rachel, Caroline, and the gentleman over there, and you are in my next round.
So this maybe is a very good question for a French politician. Franziska said at the beginning, they in the coalition agreed that sovereignty is the capacity to act in accordance with values. But there's a second part, I would argue, to sovereignty, which is the ability to decide, right? So if you have capacity to act but no ability to decide, you're not sovereign. And if you can decide but not act, also not sovereign, right? And this is where it gets a bit tricky when you talk about European sovereignty in the decision-making, which is, I think, why we mostly talk about capacity, because, and apologies, nobody in Europe likes comparisons to the United States, but I'm going to do it. So the cost of global sovereignty is a loss of local sovereignty. So you have this deal where California and Mississippi are in a deal together, and sometimes an election goes a certain way, and globally, we're Mississippi for 4 years. So it's not that different in Europe, right? I would argue there's the Californias and there's the Mississippis. Apologies to anyone who might be now compared to Mississippi. So, I mean, how ready is Europe, how ready is France, when sovereignty means being outvoted in something that's very important to you? How ready is Berlin when sovereignty means, European sovereignty means, a lack of German sovereignty? You're flatly outvoted in something very important. I think that's the question that needs to be answered.
Thank you very much. I think this is really a good question for a French diplomat and also a German parliamentary state secretary. Caroline.
Thanks for another excellent discussion. I have actually a follow-up question, not for Manuel, but for Alexander Stubb. You said just in passing, you made a very interesting remark, saying maybe the EU itself should become a member of NATO. To follow up on that, does that mean that when we offer Ukraine a candidate status, Ukraine becomes a member of NATO? And what does this mean in turn for NATO's stated goal, not to get involved in that war? If, we've all discussed this for 24 hours now, if this war is going to last for many years. Think it through, please, for me.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman at the end of the first block.
Thank you very much. Well, obviously, there are lots of new factors of sovereignty and new technologies, but also the classical ones about defense, but also the financial system. The Eurozone is a matter of differentiated integration still in the European Union, but this shift that can be also a result of the other shifts in the global value chains concerning the currencies as reserve money and trade money, and also the evolution towards the digital currency. So all that requires certainly for the European Union to think about the financial geostrategic sovereignty, isn't it?
So we have voting rights, and can France or Germany or any other great power bear to be outvoted? EU in NATO, Alex, this goes, I think, particularly to you. How would you solve the Ukraine question then? And Arancha, you might also want to comment on the financial aspect. So maybe also put differently, do we need more debt in order to become more sovereign, more joint EU debt to become more sovereign? Quick round, then I can take a second round of questions, and we can go until 5 to 2. That was what was promised to me. So just to give you a rough time frame. Who wants to start? Volunteers? Ah, yeah. My volunteer.
I almost skipped that. I think people have a sense that the French are very committed to unanimity because of the debate on QMV on foreign policy, where it is true that France has for quite some time been reluctant. But actually, we've been pushing in favor of QMV, for instance, on other issues, more the internal issues. And if you look, there is this very good and yet unfortunately unpublished SWP study, which shows one of the reasons why we are at ease with QMV. It's because in most votes, we are on the winning side. So I don't feel it's too much of a problem. And when the president mentioned in his speech in Strasbourg in January that there was a need to go for EU reform and EU treaty reform should be one of the options on the table, he did mention votes and qualified majority. But I'm not, actually, I think your question is also interesting at the global level. So one of the way the French define strategic autonomy, because we can use, we are at ease with both terms in France, is autonomy of information.
And you claim ownership of both terms,
yeah,
right?
I'm not going to enter into this dispute here. Autonomy of information, autonomy of decision, autonomy of action. So not only do I agree with your decision point, but I would including add the information part. I think that, I don't know, I'm not so sure. I was trying to think, can I go further in the metaphor of the US and the EU, etc. I think I'm going to avoid that. But one of the things that it brought me to is, for the EU, what is important is that we avoid the situation where it's not just Mississippi or California, depending on who wins, it's deadlock. That's the issue that I think is problematic. And that is one of the reasons why the Supreme Court has been so important in most of domestic US debates. It's because there's parliamentary deadlock. And now the US Supreme Court itself is going to be a source of political tensions. And that is something that I believe we need to address. And the other parts of your question that I wanted to touch is, I mentioned it, the global dimension of it. As Arancha was saying, one of the ways to look at European sovereignty is that it's what makes us rules makers rather than rules takers. But I want to build upon that in the direction that Franziska was taking, which is we don't want to be the lone rule makers. We want to be part of the global rule makers. And I fully agree that the sovereignty agenda forces us to think about our partners' sovereignty, because there's so much that we can do if they are not sovereign in the sense that we use when we talk about European sovereignty, and that's very clear with our neighbor on the eastern borders of the EU, and that's what we will need to do with Ukraine sooner rather than later, but also with Moldova, and what we need to do with the Balkans. But it's exactly also what we are saying when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. The previous French foreign minister was saying that the Indo-Pacific strategy was a strategy about sovereignty partnerships. What is important for us is that these countries remain sovereign and are shielded from vulnerabilities being weaponized against their sovereignty. And so that's part of why our sovereignty strategy needs to be about providing others with options, with precisely being able to make choices and not be stuck with only one dependency relationship.
Thank you. Arancha.
So one of the things that Europe did very well during the pandemic was to build its own fiscal capacity. This is a major turning point for Europe. And this is something that when I started as a young Commission official more than 25 years ago, I would have never dreamt. And it came true when we realized that joint borrowing was more intelligent than individual borrowing. Now, let's be clear about what joint borrowing means. It's not that you spend and someone else pays. That's not the game. You still have to pay. You still have to be responsible, and we need rules to make sure that every member state is responsible. And when I mean everyone, is everyone. But it is just simply a more intelligent way of financing the investments that Europe will need to do in the future, whether these investments are in security and defense, whether these investments are in the energy transition, whether they are in the climate adaptation, whether it's in the digital transition. It is more intelligent to do it together, simply because the borrowing costs are lower. So I hope we have learned the lesson so well that we are not going to just do a one-off. I hope that we understand this is an intelligent mechanism to also build a more resilient Europe, where fragmentation within the European Union is avoided. Now, again, responsibility, including fiscal responsibility, is going to be essential, because I can also understand that when you say joint borrowing in some parts of the European Union, the hairs go up. So we need to make sure that the hairs don't go up. It's a responsibility together. We borrow together, we repay together, and we behave in a responsible manner. That's the only way to finance the European Union.
I think hairs go up in the German coalition too when it comes to the finance ministry. But Franziska, maybe you can tell us more about what the German thinking is on this joint borrowing, also for other topics, or if you want to comment on the QMV and Germany being outvoted question.
Yeah, I start with the QMV question. You know, in the past, Germany was rarely outvoted because it abstained. So that is the regular German vote, is the abstention, because the coalition cannot agree and then they abstain. We're trying to make this better, to have actually a German position. But I must confess it's also not very easy. So in that sense, the French have an advantage which might change now. We'll see. Will be interesting to see how that plays out if all the big countries do abstain, and then the small ones take over because they have a position. No, but seriously, I think, when you look, we have majority voting in many areas where Germany is sometimes outvoted, is part of the majority, or abstains. And I think the scientific research is quite interesting, and I think there I want to, continue where Manuel has ended. The research shows that going from unanimity to QMV has always increased the pressure for compromise. It's not reduced any compromise ambition, it has just reduced the number of deadlocks. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve. It's not to have less compromises or voting somebody out, but to get over deadlocks, which you can sometimes now get over them, but they're very painful, and sometimes you don't. And I think that's what we cannot afford. And of course, the problem is that in all areas that are not defense and foreign, you can go to qualified majority without having unanimity. So it's rather easy. If you want, on social, finance, you could. On foreign defense, you need unanimity to go to QMV, and that's a difficult one. How do you cross that threshold? And I think maybe we need, we can do some tricks in terms of enlarging and deepening, and that's now my personal opinion, Because Macron put out that idea of a political union, Letta put out proposals, and I think...
discussed them yesterday.
You discussed them yesterday,
yeah.
I know. And I think, in a way, if I may say so, the French, for me, it's a bit of an empty shell. But it's a good shell that one could use to go, and go in the defense area, say, we do now a new European defense club. Our neighbors can join, but the condition to join is that you give up on unanimity. And then you would have to, maybe some of the countries who do not want to become EU members would also want to join. So I think, we have to think in new terms of how we can overcome, make this new, and I hope we will go into such directions. And on the financial one, yes, it was a big advantage, but a big mistake is that the money is only going to member states and it's not going into European transnational projects. And I really think that this was a big mistake. And whenever I would be ready to take up debt again, it would not be for national spending, but only for transnational projects, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and digital, but not for national spending.
Thank you. I promised, you get the last word, Alex, but I promised 2 people to come in with questions, and we have 4 minutes left. So you have basically a 30 seconds elevator pitch, and then Alex gets to speak, and whoever is ready to answer your question. So the gentleman over there.
Željko Ivanović from Open Science Foundations. I'm not sure if now it's working. So I would like to endorse very strongly the values point of Mr. Stubb, that Europe has to be very humble when it takes moral high ground on values in the world, especially on the issues of human rights and minorities, and not go to Chile to try to give them a lecture, because it cannot say anything to China or Russia on human rights when we see the situation of Roma people in Europe, or Jewish people, or rising anti-Semitism. Especially also in the Western Balkans, it cannot preach many lessons, maybe take some from the Western Balkans. But one thing that is missing from this conversation is demography, because it's not only about investment in technology and supply chains, it is also investment in people. And of course, aging is a huge problem in Europe.
Thank you very much. And was there a last question? I saw one. No? No. Okay. So, Alex, then you have the wonderful task to end this panel on the 2 very easy to answer questions. EU in NATO, what would that mean for Ukraine membership? And the question of, how do we address the democratic problems inside the European Union better?
Sure. Before I do that, can I just say on the voting rights? Yeah. I think, as an institutional nerd, having negotiated a few intergovernmental conferences, sometimes we get a little bit too het up about it, because the truth is that in my experience of 8 years in the council, it was quite rare that you vote. Actually, you almost never vote. So usually you end up finding a compromise. And to be honest, I do not remember one case in which Germany or France would have been outvoted. And if one finds it, I'll grab a bottle of champagne. But I don't think it actually exists. And if I'm correct, the example of Hungary and sanctions, for instance, on the decision on sanctions, it's actually qualified majority vote. But on revoking the sanctions, it's unanimity. So we could have pushed Hungary to the final mile on that, if we so desired, but usually end up finding a compromise. Might want to fact check that, but this is just my recollection. On intergovernmental conferences, sorry, if we have an intergovernmental conference, we're going to have 5 or 6 referenda. It ain't going to fly. The best way to advance the European Union is through crisis, and it's always phase number 1, crisis. Phase number 2, chaos. Phase number 3, suboptimal solution. And that's how we would have never gotten as far on finance, on health, or whatever, had we had an intergovernmental conference. Never. The steps that we've taken in the past 12 years are just humongous. So use the passerelle instead of an IGC. On EU membership in NATO, I think you caught me there. No, I mean, I think what I'm basically trying to say is that I think we need to start taking more and more responsibility of our own defenses. I think the thing, and in that sense, you know, say hypothetically that if in the long run the United States starts to withdraw from Europe, let's build that European defense then on what has already been created in terms of capacity, capability, infrastructure in NATO, and let's not see these as sort of two opposing things. If a final commercial break, you mentioned Macron and Letta. Well, tomorrow I hope, if Mark allows, I have a piece in the ECFR, but on a confederal Europe. And the idea there is also to bring the likes of Ukraine into the system as closely as possible already at this stage.
So we are, I think, 1 minute over the new time that was set. Please remain seated. Join me in thanking the panel. Don't run away. This will continue immediately. And yeah, please give a hand of applause to our wonderful panel and friends of ECFR.